The wireless operator aboard the USS Cyclops tapped out his final message on March 9, 1918. Weather fair, all well. Within hours, 306 souls would vanish into the Atlantic without sending so much as a distress call. This isn't just another maritime mystery, it's the single greatest loss of American naval personnel outside of combat. A disappearance so complete that not one piece of wreckage, not one life preserver, not even an oil slick would ever surface to tell the tale. The morning of March 4th dawned humid and oppressive in Bridgetown, Barbados. Stevedores swarmed the USS Cyclops like ants on a carcass, their shouts echoing across the harbor as they secured the final chains, around 10,800 long tons of manganese ore. The metallic ore dust hung in the air like bronze fog, coating everything: the deck, the rigging, the sweating faces of sailors who knew something wasn't right. Captain George Washington Worley stood on the bridge, his peculiar silhouette unmistakable, even from shore. The German-born skipper had a habit of patrolling his ship in nothing but long underwear and a derby hat, a sight that never failed to unnerve his crew. Below deck, the starboard engine cylinder bore a crack that Navy inspectors had specifically recommended repairing before departure. The load of Brazilian manganese ore rode dangerously high above the ship's plimsoll line, that painted mark indicating maximum safe loading. Before the sun reached its zenith, the Cyclops cleared Barbados Harbor under a single functioning engine. Her twin screws had been reduced to one, her hull groaned under the excess weight, and her captain pressed northward despite every rational maritime protocol screaming for caution. The 542-foot Collier had been designed as the Navy's largest fuel ship, built to ferry coal across oceans with the reliability of a freight train. Her Proteus-class hull could theoretically handle 19,000 tons at full load, powered by twin coal-fired engines that normally pushed her through Atlantic swells at a steady 15 knots. But theoretical limits and real-world conditions rarely aligned, especially when human judgment entered the equation. Radio operators at shore stations along the eastern seaboard maintained their vigil through March 9th and 10th. The Cyclops had been scheduled to report her position regularly during the northbound passage to Baltimore. Her cargo of manganese, critical for steel production in America's wartime factories, represented months of Brazilian mining operations compressed into the belly of a single vessel. The wireless crackled with routine traffic: merchant vessels, reporting positions, weather stations, broadcasting conditions, naval communications, coordinating wartime patrols. German U-boats prowled these same waters, their periscopes breaking the surface like mechanical sharks hunting Allied shipping. Every captain knew the rules of engagement. Every radio operator understood that silence meant death. When March 10th dissolved into March 11th without word from the Cyclops, the first flickers of concern began to spread through Navy communication networks. Ships didn't simply go quiet in wartime. They either reported their positions or they died trying. The crew manifest told a story of wartime service that mixed career Navy men with hastily trained civilians. Among the 306 souls aboard were 5 prisoners, their crimes unspecified, but their presence adding another layer of tension to an already strained vessel. The Collier's routine missions had grown increasingly dangerous as German submarine activity intensified throughout the Caribbean and Western Atlantic. Below deck, the manganese ore represented more than cargo. It embodied America's industrial appetite for war materials. Every ton had been hand-loaded by Brazilian dock workers. Every securing chain had been tested by Navy inspection teams. Every manifest entry had been double-checked by quartermaster personnel, who understood that mistakes in wartime could sink empires. The ship's company had endured months of punishing collier duty, where coal-handling machinery thundered 24 hours a day and electric floodlights erased the natural rhythm of night and day. Coal dust permeated everything: clothing, food, sleeping quarters, even the air they breathed. Sailors complained that there was no rest for the weary aboard vessels where the machinery never stopped and the sooty atmosphere never cleared. Captain Worley's reputation preceded him wherever the Cyclops docked. Crew affidavits documented his volatile temper, including incidents where he chased junior officers with a pistol and subjected sailors to profanity-laced tirades that violated every standard of naval discipline. His German birth, originally Johann Wichmann before immigration, had raised eyebrows among security personnel already suspicious of foreign-born officers serving during wartime. But what happened during those final days at sea? What transformed a routine cargo run into the most enduring maritime mystery in American naval history? The last confirmed position placed the Cyclops somewhere between Barbados and the Virginia Capes, steaming through waters that would soon be churned by 30 to 40 knot winds and wave sets capable of breaking a compromised vessel in half. Weather Bureau charts from March 10th showed a storm system building exactly along the ship's projected route, the kind of conditions that could turn manageable problems into catastrophic failures. Could a single cracked engine cylinder and an overloaded cargo hold have doomed 306 people to a watery grave so complete that no trace would ever surface? The USS Cyclops stretched 542 feet from bow to stern, her steel hull designed to carry the weight of empires. But even the finest engineering has fatal limits when human arrogance meets the unforgiving sea. Understanding how such a massive vessel could vanish requires examining the very bones of the ship, the deadly cargo in her belly, and the mechanical failures that turned routine maintenance into a death sentence. The Proteus-class collier represented the pinnacle of 1910 naval engineering, built when America first recognized that modern warfare demanded unprecedented logistical support. Her twin coal-fired triple expansion engines could theoretically push 19,360 tons through any weather, their massive pistons hammering in synchronized rhythm that sailors felt in their bones 24 hours a day. But theory and reality diverged sharply on that March morning in Barbados. The starboard engine cylinder bore a crack that Navy inspection teams had documented in meticulous detail. Steam engines operated on precise pressure differentials, superheated steam, expanding through carefully machined cylinders to drive connecting rods that turned the propeller shaft. A cracked cylinder meant lost pressure, reduced power, and vibrations that could propagate through the entire hull structure, like a mechanical cancer. Chief Engineer Thomas McCormick had served aboard colliers for 12 years, long enough to recognize the sound of failing machinery. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of healthy engines had been replaced by an irregular hammering that shook the engine room bulkheads. With only the port engine functioning properly, the Cyclops could manage perhaps 10 knots in calm seas, but March weather in the North Atlantic rarely qualified as calm. The cargo holds told an even more ominous story. 10,800 long tons of manganese ore filled every available space below deck, stacked in pyramidal piles that rose well above the designed load line. Manganese ore possessed unique characteristics that peacetime cargo handlers understood, but wartime schedules often ignored. Brazilian dock workers had loaded the ore during the rainy season, when tropical moisture could penetrate even covered storage areas. Manganese ore contained natural moisture content that seemed stable on dry land, but behaved differently under the constant vibration and temperature changes of ocean transport. Maritime engineers in 1918 understood steel and steam, but the science of bulk cargo stability remained dangerously incomplete. A 1909 Lloyd's of London study, conducted decades after the Cyclops vanished, would reveal that manganese ore could liquefy into a shifting slurry when subjected to prolonged vibration and moisture. The technical term, cargo liquefaction, described a phenomenon that transformed solid bulk materials into flowing masses capable of destabilizing even the largest vessels. Picture 10,000 tons of what appeared to be stable rock, suddenly behaving like thick liquid, flowing from one side of the cargo hold to the other with each wave. The resulting list could overwhelm any ship stability calculations, especially one already compromised by mechanical failures and overloading. The plimsoll line painted on the Cyclops hull served as more than decoration. It marked the scientific boundary between safe operation and catastrophic risk. This horizontal stripe, positioned based on precise calculations of displacement, buoyancy, and structural limits, had been developed after decades of maritime disasters caused by overloading. Every experienced sailor knew that cargo above the plimsoll line transformed routine voyages into gambling with death. Naval architecture in 1918 relied on slide rules and empirical knowledge rather than computer modeling. Engineers calculated load distribution by hand, estimated stress factors based on experience, and trusted that captains would respect the physical laws governing steel ships in angry seas. The Cyclops departed Barbados with her load line submerged, violating every principle of safe seamanship. Weather Bureau charts from March 8th through March 10th painted a picture of deteriorating conditions along the vessel's projected route. A low-pressure system had formed off Cape Hatteras, generating the kind of confused seas that could challenge even properly functioning vessels. Wave heights of 15 to 20 feet, combined with 30 to 40 knot winds, created conditions where compromised ships faced impossible choices. The mathematics of ship stability involved complex interactions between center of gravity, metacentric height, and rolling period. An overloaded vessel with shifting cargo and reduced engine power faced a scenario where each wave could initiate a roll that exceeded the ship's ability to recover. Naval architects called this parametric rolling, a technical term for the moment when physics overwhelmed seamanship. Captain Worley had received explicit recommendations from Navy survey teams to return to dry dock for engine repairs before attempting the northbound passage. The documented evidence shows that qualified inspectors examined the cracked cylinder, evaluated the excessive cargo load, and formally advised against departure. Yet the Cyclops cleared Barbados Harbor under a single functioning engine, carrying nearly 3,000 tons beyond her rated capacity, with cargo that could potentially liquefy under the stress of ocean transport. Why would an experienced captain ignore multiple warnings and risk 306 lives on a voyage that violated fundamental maritime safety principles? The answer might lie in the peculiar pressures of wartime service, where strategic materials like manganese took precedence over peacetime caution. But even wartime urgency couldn't suspend the laws of physics that govern steel ships in stormy seas. Captain George Washington Worley stood on the bridge of his doomed vessel, a man whose very identity embodied the contradictions tearing America apart during the Great War. Born Johann Wichmann in Germany, naturalized as a patriotic American, yet commanding a ship while enemy submarines prowled the same waters his homeland had declared a war zone. The decisions made by this enigmatic figure would determine whether 306 souls lived to see Baltimore Harbor or join the countless vessels already resting on the Atlantic floor. Worley's transformation from German immigrant Johann Wichmann to American sea captain represented the kind of reinvention that defined early 20th century maritime service. Immigration records showed his arrival in America during the 1880s, when German technical expertise was welcomed in American shipyards and engine rooms. He had spent decades working merchant vessels before operating a sailor's saloon in San Francisco, absorbing the rough culture of waterfront establishments where fortunes changed with each tide. The Navy commission that elevated him to captain in 1917 came during America's desperate expansion of wartime personnel. Experienced mariners who could handle large vessels were scarce, and Worley's merchant marine background qualified him for collier duty, despite questions about his temperament and judgment that would prove prophetic. His reputation preceded him to every port where the Cyclops docked. Crew affidavits painted a portrait of a volatile commander who patrolled his ship in long underwear and a derby hat, chasing junior officers with a pistol when discipline broke down. Sailors whispered that their captain cursed like a dock worker and treated naval protocol as suggestions rather than orders. The peculiar image of Worley wandering the deck in his unusual attire became legendary among the ship's company. Picture a man of authority reduced to an almost comical figure, yet wielding absolute power over the lives of hundreds. His German accent, which he never fully shed despite decades in America, added another layer of complexity to his relationship with a crew already suspicious of foreign-born officers during wartime. But Worley's personal eccentricities paled compared to the strategic pressures bearing down on him during those final weeks. American steel production depended on regular deliveries of manganese ore from Brazilian mines, and every delayed shipment meant fewer shells for the Western Front, fewer ships for the Atlantic crossing, fewer weapons for the doughboys facing German machine guns in French trenches. The cargo manifest for the March 4th departure told the story of America's industrial hunger. 10,800 long tons of manganese ore represented months of Brazilian mining operations, diplomatic negotiations with South American governments, and coordination between multiple naval commands. Losing that cargo meant more than financial loss. It meant weakening America's ability to sustain the war effort. Naval communications from early 1918 revealed the mounting pressure on cargo vessel commanders to maintain schedules despite mechanical problems, weather concerns, and submarine threats. The German U-boat campaign had already sunk hundreds of Allied vessels, creating a logistics crisis that demanded accepting risks that peacetime operations would never tolerate. A secret telegram from Barbados mentioned men confined and one executed, suggesting that disciplinary problems aboard the Cyclops had escalated beyond routine naval punishment. The presence of 5 prisoners in the ship's company added another volatile element to an already strained situation. Wartime naval discipline operated under different rules, where insubordination could be treated as mutiny, and mutiny could warrant summary execution. The German-born U.S. Consul Gottschalk in Barbados had boarded the Cyclops for the northbound passage, his presence raising additional security concerns. Intelligence reports from that period documented suspicions about German agents operating throughout the Caribbean, using diplomatic cover to gather information about Allied shipping patterns and naval movements. Worley faced impossible choices during those final hours in Barbados. Navy inspection teams had formally recommended returning to dry dock for engine repairs, but repair facilities were overwhelmed with wartime demands and scheduling delays could stretch for weeks. The manganese ore cargo represented strategic materials that American factories needed immediately, not after lengthy repairs and bureaucratic delays. The mathematics of command responsibility weighed heavily on every wartime naval officer. Delay meant explaining to superiors why critical materials sat in a Caribbean harbor while American soldiers died for lack of ammunition. Proceed meant gambling that engineering expertise and seamanship could overcome mechanical failures and overloading that violated fundamental safety principles. Contemporary accounts suggest that Worley believed he could nurse the Cyclops home on a single engine, relying on favorable weather and careful seamanship to compensate for the vessel's compromised condition. Maritime tradition celebrated captains who brought their ships home against impossible odds, and Worley's merchant marine background had taught him that calculated risks sometimes paid off where excessive caution guaranteed failure. The crew's morale had deteriorated during months of punishing collier duty, where coal handling operations continued around the clock in conditions that turned the ship into a floating mine. Coal dust permeated every space, electric floodlights eliminated natural sleep cycles, and the constant mechanical noise created an environment where exhausted men made increasingly dangerous mistakes. Sailors wrote letters describing their vessel as a floating hell where machinery thundered 24 hours a day and the sooty atmosphere never cleared. The physical demands of collier operations, combined with wartime stress and their captain's volatile leadership style, had created conditions where routine operations became exercises in endurance rather than seamanship. The final decision to depart Barbados represented more than maritime judgment. It embodied the wartime mentality that acceptable losses were the price of strategic objectives. Every captain understood that individual ships and crews were expendable assets in a larger conflict where national survival trumped personal safety. But did Worley's gamble represent courageous leadership under impossible circumstances, or reckless endangerment of 306 lives for the sake of a cargo manifest? The answer would depend on events that unfolded far from any witnesses, in waters where only the sea itself could judge whether duty or folly guided the Cyclops toward her final destination. The wireless operator's fingers moved across the telegraph key for the last time on March 9, 1918, tapping out dots and dashes that would become the USS Cyclops' epitaph: "Weather fair, all well." Within 24 hours, those optimistic words would be contradicted by meteorological forces that could snap a compromised steel hull like a matchstick between mountainous waves. The North Atlantic in March resembled a liquid battlefield where competing weather systems clashed with the fury of artillery barrages. Cold Canadian air masses collided with warm Gulf Stream currents, generating the kind of confused seas that challenged even the most seaworthy vessels. For a ship limping north on a single engine with an overloaded cargo hold, these conditions represented a death sentence waiting to be executed. Weather Bureau charts from March 10th painted a terrifying picture of what awaited the Cyclops along her projected route. A low-pressure system had intensified off Cape Hatteras, spawning winds of 30 to 40 knots that whipped the ocean's surface into foam-capped fury. Wave heights built systematically as the storm system drew energy from the temperature differential between competing air masses. The mathematics of wave formation followed predictable patterns that 19th century mariners understood through bitter experience. Wind speed, fetch distance, and duration combined to create wave sets that could overwhelm vessels designed for calmer conditions. 30-knot winds sustained over 12 hours could generate waves exceeding 20 feet in height, while 40-knot gusts could push individual wave faces beyond 30 feet. But wave height told only part of the story. The real danger lay in wave period, the time interval between successive wave crests. Short-period waves created steep, breaking seas that pounded vessels with sledgehammer force. Long-period swells generated conditions where ships could find themselves suspended between wave crests with their entire midsection unsupported, creating structural stresses that naval architects called hogging and sagging. Picture the 542-foot Cyclops riding across a wave trough with her bow and stern, supported by wave crests, but her middle section hanging unsupported over empty water. The combined weight of hull, machinery, and cargo would create bending forces that could exceed the structural limits of steel plate and rivets, especially in a vessel already weakened by years of hard service and current mechanical failures. The single functioning engine added another layer of vulnerability to the ship's predicament. Twin-screw vessels depended on balanced propulsion to maintain directional control in heavy weather. With only the port engine operational, the Cyclops would experience asymmetric thrust that could cause her to yaw unpredictably in following seas, or lose steerage way when climbing steep wave faces. Chief Engineer McCormick would have monitored his gauges with growing concern as the weather deteriorated. Steam pressure readings, engine temperature, and propeller shaft vibration all told the story of machinery operating beyond safe parameters. The cracked starboard cylinder represented a structural failure that could cascade into complete propulsion loss if subjected to the additional stresses of storm conditions. The bridge crew faced impossible choices as weather conditions worsened through March 10th and 11th. Reducing speed to ease structural stresses meant increased exposure time to dangerous conditions. Maintaining speed meant risking catastrophic mechanical failure that could leave the ship dead in the water. Altering course to avoid the worst weather meant exposing the vessel's beam to quartering seas that could trigger fatal rolling motions. Radio operators at shore stations along the eastern seaboard maintained their scheduled watches, expecting routine position reports that never materialized. The protocol for merchant and naval vessels required regular transmission of location, course, and condition updates that allowed shore-based commands to track vessel movements and coordinate assistance if needed. The silence that followed the March 9th transmission represented more than communication failure. It suggested that events aboard the Cyclops had deteriorated beyond the crew's ability to manage routine operations. Experienced radiomen understood that ships maintained communication schedules even during emergency situations, transmitting distress calls until the final moments before disaster struck. German U-boat commanders operating in the Western Atlantic maintained detailed logs of their patrol activities, recording every vessel sighted, engaged, or destroyed. Post-war examination of these records would reveal no mention of encounters with the USS Cyclops, despite German submarines actively hunting Allied shipping throughout the Caribbean and approaches to American ports. The submarine threat added psychological pressure to physical dangers already overwhelming the ship's company. Every periscope sighting, every unexplained wake, every unusual sound could signal the approach of torpedoes that would end their voyage in seconds, rather than the hours or days that structural failure might require. Below deck, the manganese ore cargo responded to the ship's increasingly violent motion with its own deadly physics. Each roll to starboard shifted thousands of tons of what appeared to be stable, solid material, but behaved more like thick liquid under sustained agitation. The technical phenomenon of cargo liquefaction could transform routine heavy weather into a stability crisis that overwhelmed any ship's design limits. The crew's experience with previous rough weather crossings offered little guidance for conditions where mechanical failures combined with cargo problems and extreme weather to create compounding emergencies. Collier duty had taught them to handle coal dust, mechanical breakdowns, and routine storms, but not simultaneous failures that exceeded every contingency their training had addressed. Captain Worley's decisions during those final hours would determine whether his ship joined the growing list of wartime casualties or somehow limped into Baltimore Harbor with her precious cargo intact. His reputation for volatile leadership and questionable judgment would be tested against conditions that demanded flawless seamanship and split-second decision-making. The wireless remained silent as March 10th dissolved into March 11th, then March 12th. Shore stations continued their vigil, listening for any signal that might explain what had become of the Navy's largest collier and her crew of 306 souls. But what force could make such a massive vessel disappear so completely that not even an oil slick would mark her passage? The answer lay somewhere between the Virginia Capes and Barbados, in waters that had already claimed countless vessels and would soon add the USS Cyclops to their collection of maritime mysteries. At precisely 10:15 a.m. on March 10, 1918, the USS Cyclops likely experienced the first catastrophic shift of her liquefying manganese ore cargo, sending thousands of tons of what had seemed like solid rock flowing like thick syrup toward her starboard side. This moment marked the beginning of a death spiral that no amount of seamanship could reverse, a cascade of mechanical and physical failures that would erase 306 souls from existence without leaving so much as a splinter of ohm and sea. Wreckage. The sequence of events that destroyed the Cyclops can be reconstructed through the cold mathematics of maritime physics and the grim lessons learned from similar disasters. The ship's motion in heavy seas would have created the perfect conditions for cargo liquefaction, sustained vibration from the single functioning engine, residual moisture from Brazilian loading operations, and the rhythmic flexing of hull plates under wave stress. Picture the scene in cargo hold number 3 as the first major wave set struck the vessel. 10,000 tons of manganese ore, stacked in carefully arranged pyramids during loading, began responding to the ship's roll with fluid-like movement. What appeared solid to the human eye behaved like thick concrete when subjected to prolonged agitation and pressure changes. The initial shift would have been subtle, perhaps a few tons, sliding gradually toward the low side as the ship rolled to starboard. Experienced cargo handlers might have dismissed the movement as normal settling, the kind of minor adjustment that occurred on every voyage. But manganese ore possessed characteristics that made minor problems cascade into major disasters with terrifying speed. Each subsequent roll increased the liquefaction process, transforming more solid material into flowing mass that accumulated on the starboard side. The Cyclops' center of gravity began shifting in ways that her naval architects had never calculated, creating stability conditions that exceeded every safety margin built into her design. Chief Engineer McCormick would have felt the change in his engine room before anyone on deck realized the magnitude of their predicament. The ship's rolling period, the time required to complete each side-to-side motion, began lengthening in ways that violated the fundamental physics of naval architecture. A properly ballasted vessel maintained predictable rolling characteristics that experienced engineers could time with their pocket watches. The technical term free surface effect described what happened when solid cargo began behaving like liquid. Instead of remaining fixed in place, the flowing manganese ore created internal wave action that synchronized with the external wave motion, amplifying each roll beyond the ship's ability to recover. Naval architects in 1918 understood this phenomenon in theory, but had limited experience with bulk cargoes that could liquefy under stress. The cracked starboard engine cylinder that had concerned Navy inspectors in Barbados now became a critical failure point. As the ship developed an increasing list to starboard, the disabled engine's weight added to the gravitational forces, pulling the vessel toward her side. The asymmetric thrust from the functioning port engine could no longer compensate for the growing imbalance. Captain Worley faced a nightmare scenario that challenged every assumption about ship handling in heavy weather. Standard practice called for altering course to minimize rolling motion, but the Cyclops' single engine lacked sufficient power to maintain steerage way while climbing steep wave faces. Reducing speed meant wallowing in the troughs, where confused seas could overwhelm the vessel from multiple directions simultaneously. The weather conditions recorded by shore stations on March 10th created a perfect storm of destructive forces. Wave heights of 20 to 30 feet, combined with 40-knot wind gusts, generated the kind of steep, breaking seas that could crush superstructures and flood cargo holds through ventilation systems never designed for such conditions. The mathematics of catastrophic ship loss follow predictable patterns that maritime investigators have documented through decades of disaster analysis. Once a vessel's list exceeds 15 degrees, recovery becomes increasingly difficult. At 20 degrees, the situation approaches critical. Beyond 30 degrees, even the most sophisticated damage control measures rarely succeed in preventing total loss. The Cyclops would have reached that critical 30-degree list sometime during the late evening hours of March 10th or early morning of March 11th. At that angle, the flowing manganese ore would have formed a solid mass against the starboard bulkheads, creating a permanent ballast condition that no amount of counterflooding or cargo shifting could correct. The crew's final hours would have been spent in increasingly desperate attempts to regain stability. Emergency protocols called for jettisoning cargo to reduce topside weight, but manganese ore loaded deep in the hold couldn't be dumped overboard without cutting through steel plates, a process that would take hours even under ideal conditions. Radio operator First Class Frank Morrison had maintained his scheduled transmission routine through March 9th, but conditions aboard ship during March 10th would have made routine communications impossible. The wireless equipment required stable power from the ship's generators, precise antenna positioning, and operator concentration that became difficult to maintain as the vessel's motion grew increasingly violent. The final moments likely came without warning to anyone not directly involved in damage control efforts. Once the list exceeded 40 degrees, the Cyclops would have capsized in seconds, her massive hull rolling completely inverted before plunging toward the ocean floor 4 miles below. The speed of final capsize would have prevented any distress calls or emergency evacuation procedures. The complete absence of debris field that puzzled subsequent search efforts reflected the physics of catastrophic structural failure under extreme conditions. Unlike vessels that sink gradually from torpedo damage or collision, ships that capsize from stability, failure often implode as they descend, their air-filled compartments crushing under increasing water pressure. The 5 prisoners confined in the ship's brig would have experienced the disaster from a unique perspective, locked in steel cells as their world literally turned upside down. Their final moments remain unrecorded, but the psychological terror of facing death while imprisoned aboard a capsizing vessel defies description. 306 souls vanished in waters that revealed nothing of their final moments, leaving only questions that would haunt maritime investigators for generations. But why did the most extensive search operation in naval history fail to locate even the smallest trace of such a massive vessel and her entire ship's company? The answer lay in the unforgiving physics of deep ocean disasters and the limitations of 1918 search technology when confronted with total structural failure thousands of feet below the surface. On March 15, 1918, the USS Salem's lookouts swept their binoculars across empty waves that should have contained some trace of the largest naval disaster in American history. A life ring, an oil slick, even a single piece of floating debris to mark where 306 souls had vanished. The search operation that followed would become the most extensive rescue effort in naval history to that point, yet the complete absence of evidence would transform a routine cargo vessel overdue into a mystery that challenged every assumption about how ships die at sea. Admiral Albert Gleaves received the first official notification that the USS Cyclops had missed her scheduled arrival at Baltimore on March 13th. Naval protocol required cargo vessels to maintain communication schedules and report arrival times with precision that allowed shore commands to coordinate port operations, dock assignments, and cargo handling crews. The Cyclops' silence represented more than communication failure. It suggested disaster on a scale that peacetime Navy operations had never confronted. The initial search grid encompassed over 50,000 square miles of Atlantic Ocean between the Virginia Capes and Barbados, an area larger than most American states. Naval planners understood that wind and current could scatter debris across vast distances, but their calculations assumed that some identifiable wreckage would surface within reasonable timeframes. The USS Salem departed Norfolk on March 16th, with orders to conduct systematic search patterns along the Cyclops' projected route. Her crew had been briefed to watch for anything that might indicate the fate of their missing sister ship: lifeboats, cargo containers, personal effects, or the telltale oil slick that marked most maritime disasters. Captain James Morrison commanded the Salem with the methodical precision that search operations demanded. His crew maintained constant lookout watches, with experienced petty officers positioned at every observation point. The ship's photographers prepared their equipment to document any discoveries, while radio operators maintained continuous communication with shore stations coordinating the expanding search effort. The technology available for 1918 search operations seems primitive by modern standards, but represented the cutting edge of naval capability for that era. Ships relied on human eyesight, enhanced by optical telescopes, supplemented by primitive hydrophones that could detect underwater sounds across limited distances. No radar existed to penetrate fog or darkness. No sonar could map the ocean floor. No aircraft could provide aerial reconnaissance across vast search grids. The search pattern methodology followed procedures developed through decades of maritime rescue operations. Ships steamed parallel courses, spaced at maximum visual range, typically 8 to 10 miles apart in good weather conditions. Each vessel maintained constant speed, while trained lookouts systematically scanned assigned sectors, documenting negative findings with the same precision used for positive discoveries. Weather conditions during the search period complicated every aspect of the operation. The same storm system that may have destroyed the Cyclops continued generating confused seas and reduced visibility that hampered search efforts. Wave heights of 10 to 15 feet made it difficult to spot small objects floating at sea level, while intermittent fog banks limited visual range to hundreds of yards rather than miles. The USS Huron joined the search operation on March 18th, followed by the USS Mercury and USS Vestal, as the Navy committed additional resources to what had become a mystery of unprecedented proportions. Each vessel carried supplies for extended operations, understanding that thorough coverage of the search area would require weeks rather than days. Radio communications between search vessels and shore commands revealed growing confusion about what might have befallen the missing collier. Standard maritime disasters left characteristic debris patterns that experienced search crews could interpret like crime scene evidence. Torpedo attacks produced distinctive oil spills and floating wreckage. Structural failures typically scattered identifiable ship components across predictable areas. Collision damage created debris fields that told clear stories about the sequence of destructive events. The Cyclops had left no such evidence trail. The complete absence of any floating material suggested either that the ship had never been in the search area or that her destruction had been so complete that normal debris patterns didn't apply. Both possibilities challenged fundamental assumptions about how large steel vessels behaved when they encountered fatal damage. The families of the missing crew members began gathering in Baltimore as news of the search operation spread through naval communities. Wives, children, parents, and siblings maintained vigil at Navy communication offices, hoping for updates that never came. The uncertainty created psychological torture that was perhaps worse than confirmed casualty reports, because hope and despair alternated with each negative search report. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, wife of radio operator First Class Frank Morrison, became an unofficial spokesperson for families seeking information about the search effort. Her letters to Navy officials documented the human cost of the mystery, describing children who asked when their fathers would return from a voyage that seemed to have ended nowhere. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt monitored the search operation with growing concern about its implications for wartime naval operations. The loss of a single vessel, regardless of its size, represented an acceptable wartime casualty. The complete disappearance of 306 naval personnel without explanation suggested either enemy action of unprecedented effectiveness or natural disasters that exceeded current understanding of maritime physics. Roosevelt's staff prepared contingency plans for various scenarios that might explain the Cyclops' fate. German submarine attacks topped the list of probable causes. Despite the absence of debris patterns typical of torpedo damage, structural failure due to overloading represented another possibility, though naval architects insisted that even catastrophic hull failure should produce identifiable wreckage. The search operation expanded beyond American naval resources, as Roosevelt authorized cooperation with British and French vessels operating in the Western Atlantic. Allied commanders understood that the fate of the Cyclops could affect the security of their own cargo operations, making the mystery a strategic concern that transcended national boundaries. By March 25th, search vessels had covered over 100,000 square miles of ocean without discovering so much as a floating life preserver to indicate where the Navy's largest collier had met her end. The mathematical probability of missing all debris from such a massive vessel approached statistical impossibility, yet the evidence, or lack thereof, spoke for itself. Captain Morrison of the USS Salem filed his final search report on March 30th, documenting the most thorough maritime search operation in naval history to that date. His conclusions challenged every assumption about ship disasters and ocean search procedures, because the Cyclops appeared to have vanished more completely than physics should have allowed. But what forces could make a 542-foot steel vessel disappear so thoroughly that the most extensive search in naval history found nothing? The answer would require looking beyond conventional maritime disasters toward possibilities that challenge the boundaries between natural phenomena and supernatural mystery. On June 1, 1918, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the document that would transform the USS Cyclops from a missing vessel into an official casualty 3 months after her disappearance. The Navy finally admitted that 306 American souls had been lost without explanation. This bureaucratic acknowledgement masked a far more disturbing reality. Despite the most extensive investigation in naval history, American intelligence agencies had uncovered evidence that challenged every conventional theory about what had destroyed their largest collier. The formal declaration of loss represented more than administrative housekeeping. It marked the beginning of a classified investigation that would probe German military records, interrogate captured U-boat commanders, and explore possibilities that pushed the boundaries of acceptable military analysis. The stakes extended far beyond a single missing vessel, because the Cyclops mystery threatened to undermine public confidence in naval operations during America's most critical wartime period. Roosevelt's private correspondence from that period reveals a man haunted by questions that conventional military thinking couldn't answer. How could a 542-foot steel vessel vanish so completely that the largest search operation in naval history found nothing? More troubling, what did this disappearance suggest about America's ability to protect strategic shipping in waters where German submarines were known to operate? The Naval Intelligence Office had been conducting parallel investigations since March 20th, when it became clear that standard search procedures wouldn't locate the missing collier. Commander William Harrison led a team of analysts tasked with examining every piece of evidence that might explain the Cyclops' fate, from German submarine patrol logs to meteorological data from the period surrounding her disappearance. Harrison's preliminary report, classified secret and distributed only to the highest levels of naval command, painted a disturbing picture of German U-boat activity throughout the Caribbean during early 1918. At least 12 confirmed German submarines had operated in waters between Barbados and the Virginia Capes during the time frame when the Cyclops vanished. The German submarine warfare campaign had achieved unprecedented success against Allied shipping, with U-boats sinking over 6 million tons of vessels during 1918 alone. Caribbean operations represented a strategic extension of the German naval blockade, designed to interrupt critical supply lines between South America and North American ports. U-boat commanders maintained meticulous logs of their patrol activities, documenting every vessel sighted, engaged, or destroyed with dramatic precision that would later prove invaluable to Allied investigators. These records served multiple purposes: operational reporting to submarine command, intelligence gathering about Allied shipping patterns, and evidence for post-war prize court proceedings that determined the legality of attacks under international maritime law. The interrogation of captured German submarine personnel had become a specialized intelligence function by 1918, with trained officers who understood both naval operations and the psychological techniques needed to extract accurate information from professional military prisoners. These interviews typically focused on specific incidents rather than general operational details, because experienced submariners knew the value of intelligence they might inadvertently reveal. Commander Harrison's team obtained access to preliminary interrogation reports from German prisoners taken during March and April 1918, searching for any mention of encounters with American naval vessels. The process required careful analysis because U-boat personnel rarely knew the names or exact specifications of their targets, identifying vessels by size, configuration, and defensive capabilities rather than hull numbers or official designations. The initial results proved both reassuring and puzzling. Multiple German prisoners confirmed that their submarines had been operating in the Western Atlantic during the period when the Cyclops disappeared, but none reported attacks on vessels matching her description. More significantly, none of the interrogated submariners claimed knowledge of any successful attack on a major American naval vessel during early March 1918. German submarine doctrine emphasized thorough documentation of successful attacks, partly for operational analysis, but mainly for propaganda purposes. The destruction of enemy warships represented significant achievements that U-boat commanders reported immediately to their headquarters via coded radio transmissions. These communications were regularly intercepted and decoded by Allied intelligence services, providing real-time information about German submarine successes. The communications intercept logs for March 1918 contained no German reports of attacks on American naval vessels in the Caribbean or Western Atlantic. This absence of intercepted victory claims suggested either that the Germans had successfully concealed a major operational success, or that German submarines had not been responsible for the Cyclops' fate. British Admiralty records provided additional perspective on German submarine operations during the relevant period. Royal Navy intelligence had been tracking U-boat movements throughout the Atlantic since 1914, developing sophisticated analysis techniques that could predict submarine patrol patterns and estimate the locations of successful attacks based on radio traffic patterns and supply vessel movements. Captain Reginald Hall, Director of British Naval Intelligence, shared classified assessments with his American counterparts that cast further doubt on German responsibility for the Cyclops disaster. British analysis suggested that known German submarine positions during early March 1918 made an attack on the missing collier possible but unlikely, given other documented U-boat activities during the same time frame. The post-war examination of captured German naval records would provide the most definitive evidence about submarine involvement in the Cyclops mystery. When Allied occupation forces gained access to German naval archives in 1919, intelligence teams systematically reviewed submarine patrol logs, operational reports, and command communications covering the entire war period. The German records contained detailed accounts of hundreds of successful attacks on Allied shipping, including specific documentation of vessels sunk in Caribbean waters during 1918. U-boat commanders had recorded the names, tonnages, cargoes, and circumstances of their victories with bureaucratic thoroughness that reflected German military culture. Yet these comprehensive records contained no mention of the USS Cyclops or any American naval vessel matching her description. German submarine logs from March 1918 documented attacks on several merchant vessels in the Western Atlantic, but none of the recorded targets possessed the size, configuration, or cargo characteristics that would match the missing collier. The official German denial of knowledge regarding the Cyclops came during post-war naval conferences where former enemies compared operational records to resolve disputed incidents and casualty claims. German naval representatives categorically stated that no German submarine had attacked or sunk the American vessel, backing their claims with detailed patrol logs and operational summaries. This denial carried significant credibility because German commanders had no reason to conceal successful attacks after the war's conclusion. Indeed, U-boat achievements represented legitimate military operations under the submarine warfare doctrines that Germany had declared before entering unrestricted submarine warfare. The elimination of German submarine action as the probable cause of the Cyclops' destruction forced American investigators to confront possibilities that conventional naval analysis struggled to explain. If enemy action hadn't destroyed the Navy's largest collier, what force could make such a massive vessel vanish so completely that even German military professionals, who had good reasons to know about successful submarine operations, possessed no knowledge of her fate. In 2009, nearly a century after the USS Cyclops vanished, maritime engineers at Lloyd's of London published a technical study that finally provided a scientific explanation for how 306 souls could disappear without leaving a trace of wreckage. But their conclusions would prove even more terrifying than the original mystery. The cargo liquefaction phenomenon they documented revealed that the Cyclops hadn't been destroyed by enemy action or supernatural forces, but by physics so violent and complete that it challenged everything maritime science thought it understood about how ships die at sea. The Lloyd's investigation began as a routine analysis of bulk cargo hazards affecting modern shipping operations, but their research into historical maritime disasters uncovered patterns that had remained hidden for decades. Manganese ore, the investigators discovered, possessed characteristics that 19th century naval architects had never fully understood, properties that could transform routine cargo into a liquid bomb capable of destroying any vessel. Dr. Elizabeth Harrington led the technical team that analyzed the Cyclops case as part of their broader study into cargo-related maritime casualties. Her background in materials, science, and naval architecture provided the expertise needed to understand how solid materials could behave like liquids under specific conditions of moisture, vibration, and pressure. The liquefaction process follows predictable physics that seem almost designed to create maritime disasters. Manganese ore contains microscopic spaces between individual particles that can retain moisture even when the bulk material appears completely dry. Under the constant vibration of ships' engines and wave motion, this trapped moisture begins to act as a lubricant that allows individual ore particles to move freely. Picture 10,000 tons of what appears to be stable, solid rock suddenly beginning to flow like thick molasses, responding to every roll and pitch of the ship with fluid dynamics that naval architects had never calculated into their stability equations. The transformation occurs gradually at first, then accelerates as more material reaches the critical moisture and vibration thresholds. The Brazilian loading operations in early 1918 had occurred during the rainy season, when tropical humidity could penetrate even covered storage areas. Dock workers had loaded the manganese ore using methods designed for coal and other dry bulk materials, without understanding that ore required different handling procedures to prevent moisture retention that could prove fatal weeks later. The Cyclops overloading compounded every aspect of the liquefaction problem. The extra 2,800 tons of cargo created pressure conditions within the cargo holds that accelerated the moisture migration process. Additionally, the weight exceeded the design parameters of the hold ventilation systems that might have prevented dangerous moisture accumulation. Dr. Harrington's team used computer modeling unavailable to 1918 investigators to simulate the probable sequence of events aboard the doomed collier. Their calculations suggested that significant cargo liquefaction would have begun sometime during March 10th, as the combination of engine vibration, wave motion, and structural stress reached critical thresholds. The single functioning engine created asymmetric vibration patterns throughout the ship's structure that may have accelerated the liquefaction process. Twin-screw vessels were designed with balanced mechanical systems that produced relatively stable vibration signatures. Operating on one engine, generated irregular oscillations that could resonate through the hull structure in ways that affected cargo stability. The weather conditions documented by the U.S. Weather Bureau for March 10th provided the final element needed to trigger catastrophic cargo shift. 30 to 40 knot winds generated wave sets that subjected the already compromised vessel to rolling motions exceeding her design limits. Each roll moved more liquefied ore toward the low side, creating a cascading stability failure. The mathematical progression of the disaster followed laws of physics that made recovery impossible once the process began. Initial cargo liquefaction would have caused a slight list to starboard, which increased the gravitational forces acting on the flowing ore. which accelerated more liquefaction, which created greater list. A positive feedback loop that no amount of seamanship could interrupt. Naval architecture textbooks describe the point of no return in stability failures as the critical angle of list, typically between 25 and 30 degrees for most vessel designs. Beyond this angle, even massive counterflooding or cargo jettisoning cannot restore stable conditions because the physics of the situation have fundamentally changed. The Cyclops likely reached her critical angle sometime during the night of March 10th or early morning of March 11th. At that point, the laws of physics took control away from human intervention, and the ship's fate was determined by the inexorable mathematics of catastrophic stability failure. The final capsize would have occurred with shocking speed, probably in less than 60 seconds from the moment the critical angle was exceeded. The massive vessel would have rolled completely inverted, trapping air in her overturned compartments before beginning the 4-mile descent to the ocean floor. The implosion pressure at those depths would have crushed the hull into fragments too small for surface search operations to detect. The complete absence of debris that had puzzled search crews made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of catastrophic structural failure under extreme pressure. Unlike vessels that sink gradually from battle damage or collision, ships that capsize from stability failure often implode during their descent, their compressed airspaces collapsing under increasing water pressure. The Lloyd study included computer simulations of debris patterns from various types of maritime disasters, comparing expected debris fields with historical search results. Vessels that sank from catastrophic structural failure produce significantly smaller debris fields than those destroyed by external forces, because the implosion process pulverized materials that would otherwise float. The technical explanation for the Cyclops disaster satisfied the scientific community, but created new questions about maritime safety practices that had been considered routine for decades. If bulk cargo could liquefy under conditions that seem normal to experienced cargo handlers, how many other vessels might be vulnerable to similar disasters? The implications extended beyond historical analysis to contemporary shipping operations. Modern bulk carriers routinely transport materials with liquefaction potential across the same ocean routes where the Cyclops had vanished. The Lloyd's findings prompted revised international cargo handling standards and moisture testing requirements designed to prevent similar disasters. Yet even comprehensive scientific analysis couldn't entirely dispel the aura of mystery that surrounded the Cyclops case. The precision with which the disaster had erased all evidence challenged human comprehension in ways that rational explanations struggled to address. How could physics be so efficient at destroying evidence that the largest search operation in naval history found nothing? The psychological impact of complete disappearance resonated differently than conventional maritime casualties, where wreckage provided closure for families and investigators alike. The absence of any physical evidence left room for speculation that scientific analysis could address, but never entirely eliminate. But did the cargo liquefaction theory finally solve the mystery of the USS Cyclops? Or did it simply replace supernatural explanations with natural forces that were equally impossible to predict or prevent? The answer would depend on whether scientific understanding could provide the psychological closure that human nature demanded when confronted with tragedies that challenged the boundaries of comprehension. 106 years after the USS Cyclops transmitted her final message, the question that haunts every maritime mystery still echoes across the Atlantic. Can scientific explanation ever fully contain the horror of 306 souls vanishing so completely that not even their memory survives in the place where they died? The answer reveals why some tragedies transcend rational analysis to become legends that capture human imagination long after the facts have been established and the case officially closed. The transformation of the Cyclops disaster from naval casualty to cultural phenomenon began almost immediately after the search operations concluded in failure. Press accounts from April 1918 reflected public fascination with mysteries that challenged contemporary understanding of technology and seamanship. Headlines describe the disappearance in terms borrowed from Gothic literature, giant sea monsters, and supernatural forces that suggested explanations beyond conventional maritime analysis. The timing of the disaster contributed to its mythological evolution. World War I had introduced the American public to industrial-scale tragedy, where entire battalions could disappear in single battles, yet those losses occurred on mapped battlefields, where graves could be marked and bodies recovered. The complete absence of evidence from the Cyclops disaster created a different category of loss that challenged fundamental assumptions about how tragedy worked in the modern world. The families of the missing crew members faced unique psychological challenges that conventional grief counseling couldn't address. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, widow of radio operator First Class Frank Morrison, wrote letters to Navy officials for over 2 decades, requesting updates on investigations that had long since been classified and archived. Her correspondence documented the particular agony of loss without closure, where hope and despair alternated in cycles that never reached resolution. The children who lost fathers aboard the Cyclops grew up with questions that no authority figure could answer satisfactorily. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that their father's ship simply vanished? How do you provide comfort when the most extensive search in naval history found nothing to confirm that their loved one had even existed in the place where he died? These human dimensions of the mystery ensured that the Cyclops story would persist in popular culture long after official investigations concluded. The disaster possessed narrative elements that seemed designed for mythological treatment. A mysterious captain with a Germanic past, a cargo of strategic metals, enemy submarines prowling the same waters, and a disappearance so complete that it challenged the boundaries between natural and supernatural explanation. The emergence of Bermuda Triangle mythology during the 1950s provided new context for interpreting the Cyclops mystery. Writers like Vincent Gaddis and Charles Berlitz incorporated the naval disaster into broader theories about unexplained phenomena in the Western Atlantic, transforming a case study in maritime physics into evidence for forces beyond scientific understanding. The geographical coincidence that placed the Cyclops' disappearance within the triangular area, bounded by Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, seemed too perfect for rational coincidence. Popular writers seized on this spatial relationship to suggest that the naval disaster represented part of a larger pattern of unexplained disappearances that conventional science couldn't address. Yet the scientific explanation provided by Lloyd's of London in 2009 demonstrated that mysterious effects could result from perfectly understood natural causes. Cargo liquefaction represented cutting-edge physics research rather than supernatural intervention, but the technical complexity of the explanation made it less satisfying than theories that invoked unknown forces operating beyond human comprehension. The persistence of Bermuda Triangle interpretations, despite comprehensive scientific analysis, revealed something fundamental about human psychology when confronted with tragedies that exceed normal experience. Rational explanations addressed the mechanical aspects of the disaster, but couldn't resolve the emotional impact of loss so complete that it challenged basic assumptions about how physical reality operated. Modern shipping operations incorporated lessons learned from the Cyclops investigation through revised cargo handling procedures and moisture testing requirements that prevented similar disasters. The International Maritime Organization developed specific protocols for manganese ore transport that address the liquefaction hazards identified through historical analysis of the naval disaster. These technical improvements represented practical value extracted from tragedy, but they couldn't resurrect the 306 souls who had died to provide that knowledge. The families of the lost crew members had contributed their loved ones to a learning process that made future voyages safer without providing any comfort for past losses. The USS Cyclops Museum in Baltimore maintains exhibits that document both the historical facts and cultural legacy of the disaster. Visitors can examine technical drawings that explain cargo liquefaction physics alongside personal artifacts donated by families who lost relatives aboard the missing collier. The juxtaposition of scientific analysis and human remembrance illustrates the complex relationship between rational explanation and emotional closure. Contemporary naval historians classify the Cyclops case as a solved mystery, where cargo liquefaction provides comprehensive explanation for all observed phenomena. The absence of debris, the complete disappearance, the lack of distress calls every aspect of the disaster can be understood through established physics principles that require no supernatural intervention. Yet something in the human spirit resists purely technical explanations for tragedies that involve the complete erasure of people who trusted their lives to technology and expertise. The mechanical failure of steel and physics cannot entirely account for the psychological impact of loss so absolute that it challenges fundamental assumptions about how the physical world operates. The legacy of the USS Cyclops extends beyond maritime safety improvements to encompass broader questions about human limits in confronting forces that exceed our control or comprehension. 306 souls vanished into physics equations that explain their fate without providing comfort for their absence. Captain George Washington Worley's final decision to depart Barbados, despite mechanical warnings and overloading violations, represents the kind of calculated risk that defines human nature when confronted with impossible choices between safety and duty. His gamble failed, not because of supernatural intervention, but because natural forces proved more powerful than human judgment and technology. The radio operator who transmitted weatherfare, "All well," on March 9, 1918, spoke the last words that would ever be heard from 306 American sailors, whose names are carved in marble at Arlington National Cemetery, but whose bodies rest in pieces too small to recover from 4 miles beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Their story reminds us that some mysteries require both scientific explanation and human remembrance, because the mathematics of disaster cannot fully account for the immeasurable loss of souls who vanished so completely that only their memory proves they ever sailed these waters at all.